An elderly fisherman found a giant mollusk on the shore, but when he opened it, he found something inside that changed his life forever. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The old man rose before the sun, as he had done for most of his 72 years, the air in his small wooden shack still cool and damp from the night. Outside, the first suggestion of dawn was brushing the horizon, a pale silver line beyond the dark stretch of water that was his home and livelihood. Eli Harper, weathered by decades of salt, wind, and sun, moved slowly but with the quiet precision of a man who knew every step of his morning by heart. The boards beneath his feet creaked softly as he crossed the narrow room, his fingers brushing against the back of the worn rocking chair where he often sat in the evenings, listening to the ocean breathe. He poured himself a small tin mug of black coffee, the smell rich and bitter, and stepped onto the porch. His shack was perched just above the tide line, so close to the water that in heavy storms, the spray from the waves slapped against the steps. Paint peeled from its walls in uneven curls, revealing the gray grain beneath, wood that had been bleached and scarred by decades of salt air. A crooked railing leaned toward the sea as though listening. To anyone else, it might have looked abandoned, but for Eli, it was the only place in the world where he still felt anchored. The shoreline curved away in both directions, a mix of sand and jagged outcrops. Behind him lay the cluster of small houses that made up the fishing village, though they were far enough away that he could pretend he lived entirely alone. And in many ways, he did. His wife had died 20 years earlier when the great hurricane tore through the coast. The storm had claimed more than homes. It had taken her life, swallowed their boat, and dragged their only son out into the raging sea when he had tried to help neighbors secure their vessels. Eli had rebuilt what he could, but he had never replaced the emptiness left by their absence. He sipped the coffee slowly, letting the steam warm his face. In the quiet between the distant rush of waves and the occasional cry of a gull, he thought about the years. His hair, once black as wet tar, was now white and coarse. The deep brown of his skin was lined with a network of creases, each one carved by sun and hardship. His hands were still strong, the grip calloused from rope and oar, but his shoulders ached more with each passing season. He was, he often told himself, the last of his line here. There were no children to carry the Harper name, no one to take the small shack or the battered fishing boat when he was gone. Yet life had its rituals, and he clung to them. After the coffee came the slow walk down to the dock, his boots crunching over damp sand, his eyes always scanning the water. His boat, the Ruth, named for his wife, bobbed gently against its moorings, her paint faded, but her hull sound. He'd kept her alive with the same stubborn care he'd given to himself. He checked the nets stacked in the stern, running his fingers along the knots. Each one was tied in the old style his grandfather had taught him, tight and sure. As he readied the engine, his mind wandered, as it often did, to the stories his grandfather had told him when he was a boy. They were tales of the sea, part warning, part wonder. One in particular had stayed with him all his life, the legend of the Dawn Pearl. His grandfather swore that once every 100 years the sea gave up a gift hidden inside an ancient clam, so old it had seen the turn of a century. This clam, he said, held within it a pearl that carried the light of the morning sun itself. It would be as big as a man's fist, glowing with a color no one could name, and whoever found it would be forever changed. As a boy, Eli had believed it with the wide-eyed certainty of youth. As a man, he had laughed it off, knowing that the sea was full of strange shapes and stranger tales, but none that would put food on the table. Still, the image of it sometimes surfaced in the quiet hours, unbidden, a perfect sphere of impossible light, hidden deep beneath the waves. When the sun finally lifted above the horizon, streaking the sky with soft gold and rose, Eli pushed the boat away from the dock. The engine coughed, then steadied into its familiar low growl. He turned the bow toward open water, past the calm shallows where herons stood on long legs, watching him pass. His route was one he knew as well as his own heartbeat. It took him along the outer curve of the bay, then around the rocky headland, and into the deeper channels where the fish were thickest this time of year. The tide was with him, the surface broken now and then by the leap of a mullet or the ripple of something larger passing below. Out here, surrounded by water and sky, Eli felt both the weight of his years and the strange lightness that came from knowing the sea still had room for him. He could read the shift of the wind by the tilt of a cloud, tell the time by the angle of the sun on the water. The only voices were the gulls overhead and the whisper of waves against the hull. He kept his eyes scanning the surface, noting the slicks that marked schools of fish, the darker shadows that might be dolphins or stingrays gliding past. There was a peace in the repetition. Cast, wait, haul, check the catch, cast again. The morning passed in a slow rhythm, the nets bringing in enough to make the trip worthwhile. But underneath that peace was a restlessness he could not quite name. Maybe it was the season turning, or maybe it was the weight of too many years spent in the same patterns. Sometimes he thought he could feel the tide pulling at him, urging him toward something unseen, as though the water itself was holding a secret just out of reach. As the sun climbed higher, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of rain far out to sea. Eli adjusted his course slightly, heading towards the shadow of the headland. There were places near those rocks where the current moved strangely, churning in tight circles as if guarding something. Most men avoided them, but Eli knew how to read their moods, how to slip between them without being caught. He had no particular reason to go that way today, only a pull, faint but insistent, like a thread winding through the air. He told himself it was for the fishing, that maybe the movement of the tides had brought a shoal into the sheltered waters near the cliffs. But deep down, he knew he was following something else, something that had no name. It was the same pull he had felt as a boy when his grandfather had spoken of the dawn pearl, the same flicker of curiosity that had drawn him to explore the dangerous shallows in his youth. By the time the headland loomed before him, its black rocks jagged against the blue, the tide was rising, and the surface shimmered with shifting light. Somewhere beyond those rocks, unseen and silent, the sea held its treasures. Eli slowed the engine, the low rumble fading to a purr, and felt the quiet deepen around him. He didn't know yet that the course he had chosen this morning would change everything, that the rest of his days would be measured in the time before and after this voyage. For now, there was only the steady breath of the ocean and the weight of the years behind him, carrying him forward into waters that felt older than memory itself. He guided the Ruth closer to the rocks, eyes scanning the shifting patterns of foam and shadow. The pull in his chest was stronger now, almost a physical sensation, like the tide had found its way into his heartbeat. Somewhere ahead, past the jagged teeth of stone, a faint gleam winked in the moving water. It was nothing more than a flash, a trick of light on the waves, or so he told himself. But he knew, as he reached for the tiller, that he was going to follow it. And so he turned the bow toward the narrow channel, where the sea moved like a living thing, and the first step toward the impossible had already been taken, though he could not yet see where it would lead. The narrow channel between the rocks seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, the tide pulling and pushing in deep, slow pulses. Eli eased back the throttle, letting the Ruth drift, the water beneath her turning from blue to a green so dark it was almost black. He could feel the hum of the current through the soles of his boots, a low, steady vibration that made him think of the earth's heartbeat. The morning fog had not yet burned off here. It clung to the surface in pale ribbons, curling around the jagged edges of the headland like smoke wrapping the frame of a half-forgotten ruin. Above, gulls wheeled and called in restless arcs, their cries sharp against the muffled hush of the mist. He guided the boat closer, his eyes searching the water for that glimmer he had seen before. At first, there was nothing, just the muted shift of light through the fog and the endless, slow churn of the tide. But then, as he nosed past a boulder that jutted from the sea like the prow of some ancient ship, there it was again. A flicker of gold, a flash that was not the ordinary gleam of sunlight on wave. This light was softer, warmer, almost alive, as though it came from within the water itself. It winked once, then disappeared, only to reappear a few feet away, drifting in and out of sight as the current moved. Eli's grip on the tiller tightened. He had learned long ago that the sea played tricks, especially when the fog rolled in, but this was different. The glow seemed too steady, too deliberate to be chance. He kept the Ruth steady, edging forward in small bursts weaving between the rocks. The channel narrowed, the water swirling around the hull in slow eddies, and with each turn the light ahead grew stronger. It wasn't bright enough to blind, but it held a weight, a pull that drew his gaze and refused to let it go. As he rounded another bend in the channel, the source of the light began to take shape. At first, he thought it was a rock crusted over with barnacles, but the surface was too smooth, too rounded. The fog thinned just enough for him to see the outline clearly, an enormous clam wedged deep in a cleft between two massive stones. Its shell was the color of weathered bronze, streaked with green where the sea had laid its claim, and yet there was a sheen to it that caught the light even in the mist. The glow came from a thin seam between the shell's two halves, a faint golden radiance that pulsed in time with the swell. Eli cut the engine and let the boat drift the last few yards. The air was heavy here, thick with the scent of salt and kelp, and the sound of the waves seemed muted, as though the sea itself were holding its breath. He leaned over the side, his fingers gripping the gunwale, and stared. The Clam was unlike anything he had ever seen in all his years on the water. It was massive, at least 4 feet across, its ridged shell curving upward in a broad arc. Tiny fish darted in and out of the crevice around it, their scales catching fragments of that inner light, and the sight made the whole scene feel unreal, as though he had drifted into some dream the ocean was having. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in decades, awe. Not the simple appreciation for a good catch or a beautiful sunrise, but the deeper kind, the kind that hummed in his bones and made him feel, for a moment, like a boy again, standing on the dock while his grandfather spoke in a low, secretive voice about treasures the sea hid from most men. The Dawn Pearl. He could hear the words in the old man's voice as clearly as if they were being spoken beside him now. A pearl that held the light of the morning sun. A gift that would come to only one fisherman in 100 years. Eli shook his head, trying to clear the thought. It was foolish to let an old story take root in his mind. And yet, he could not look away from the way the light seeped from that narrow gap between the clam's shells, faint but steady, a whisper of something waiting inside. He knew the Clam was alive. The occasional ripple along its edge told him it was still breathing, still holding itself closed against the world. But he also knew the sea would not have left it here without reason. The tides could have carried it anywhere, yet it was caught in this narrow place within reach. His first instinct was caution. This was not the sort of catch a man could simply pull into his boat. Its size alone made that impossible, and the rocks here were treacherous. One wrong move, and the hull could be holed on the sharp stone beneath the waterline. He would need to think, to work out a way to free it without losing himself in the process. The weight of the task settled on him, heavy but strangely welcome. It had been years since he'd faced a challenge that stirred his blood like this. He sat back on the bench, letting the Ruth drift just beyond the reach of the rocks, and thought about his options. He had rope enough to lash it, maybe even to drag it clear if the tide was with him. But he would need help, another pair of hands, someone he trusted. In this village, that list was short, and it had grown shorter over the years. Still, one name came to mind. Leonard. The old man's closest friend, a fisherman with as much salt in his veins as Eli himself, and one who knew how to keep his mouth shut when it mattered. The fog thickened again, curling low over the water, and the glow from the Clam dimmed, swallowed in the shifting gray. Eli started the engine, the sudden growl loud in the muffled air, and backed the Ruth away from the rocks. He kept his eyes fixed on the spot until it vanished from sight, marking in his mind the way the channel bent, the shapes of the stones around it. He would need to find it again, and when he did, he would be ready. As he turned the boat toward open water, the mist began to lift, pulling back in thin strands until the sun broke through, spilling gold across the waves. It felt almost like a sign, though he would not say it aloud. He kept his face set, his hands steady on the tiller, but inside, something had shifted. The day's fishing no longer mattered. His thoughts were already on the return trip, on the ropes he would need, on the careful planning that could bring the Clam, and whatever it held, back to shore. By the time the village came into view, small and sunlit against the curve of the bay, Eli knew the rest of the day would be nothing but preparation. He would mend the strongest of his lines, check the knots twice, and wait until the tide favored him. And when he went back into that narrow channel, he would not go alone. The Clam's glow still lingered in his mind's eye, steady and warm, and with it came the echo of his grandfather's voice, a pearl that holds the light of the morning sun. He didn't believe in legends, not really, but as the Ruth slid into her berth and the water lapped against the dock, Eli found himself smiling, just a little, at the thought that maybe, just maybe, the old stories had a way of finding the men who were meant to see them. The sun was leaning westward by the time Eli finished mending the last of his heavy ropes. He sat on the overturned crate outside his shack, running his fingers along each coil, feeling for frays or weaknesses, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The afternoon heat clung to the air, mingling with the sharp tang of salt drifting in from the shore. He had gone over his supplies twice, maybe 3 times, making sure every knot was as tight as the day it had been tied. The work steadied him, kept his mind from wandering too far ahead to what lay waiting in the channel beyond the headland. Yet, no matter how carefully he focused on the familiar rhythm of his preparations, the image of the great Clam kept rising unbidden in his thoughts, its vast, curved shell wedged between stone, the faint golden light seeping from the seam where the two halves met. Leonard arrived just as the sun began to slip lower, his boots thudding against the dock as he approached. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered despite the years, with a beard that had gone white in sharp streaks against the dark of his skin. Eli had known him since they were boys, and there was no one else he would have trusted with this task. Leonard didn't ask questions until he had taken a seat beside Eli, resting his elbows on his knees and looking out toward the horizon where the water met the fading light. When Eli told him what he had found, he kept his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might draw unwanted ears. Leonard listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the shifting line of the tide. When Eli finished, there was a long pause. Then Leonard turned to him, and in his eyes there was a flicker of something Eli recognized, curiosity sharpened by the weight of possibility. "You're sure?" Leonard asked finally, and Eli nodded. There was no mistaking it, not in his mind. He had seen enough in his life to know the difference between a trick of light and something extraordinary. They moved quickly after that, gathering the tools they would need: the thick ropes, the gaff hooks, a pair of old boat hooks, the long-handled knife Leonard kept for cutting stubborn lines. They loaded them onto the Ruth, the boards of her deck creaking under the added weight. The evening breeze had begun to stir, carrying with it the smell of the open sea, and the gulls were making their way inland, their calls growing fainter with distance. It would be better to go now, under the cover of the waning light, when fewer eyes would be watching from the shore. By the time they cleared the mouth of the bay, the last of the sun's glow had stretched across the water, turning it into a field of molten copper. The Ruth cut through it steadily, her bow rising and falling with the long swells rolling in from the deeper waters. Eli kept his course straight toward the headland, his hands steady on the tiller, while Leonard sat opposite him, coiling and uncoiling a length of rope with the absent-minded focus of a man already thinking ahead to the work at hand. The fog had not yet returned when they reached the narrow channel, but the water there was still restless, curling in on itself as if guarding the secret it held. Eli slowed the boat, easing her into the familiar path he had traced earlier that day, his eyes scanning the shapes of the rocks, noting the subtle changes in the current. He felt the same pull in his chest as before, stronger now that he was returning with the means to act. When the Clam came into view, Leonard let out a low whistle. Even in the dimming light, the shell's surface gleamed with that strange, muted radiance, as though the last rays of the sun had taken root within it. The size alone was enough to make them both pause. Neither man had seen anything like it in all their years at sea. It was a relic of another time, older than their fathers and grandfathers, perhaps older than the village itself. They worked in silence, maneuvering the Ruth as close as they dared without risking her against the rocks. The water swirled and tugged at her hull, but Eli's steady hand kept her in place. Leonard leaned over the side, looping the first rope around one of the ridges near the Clam's hinge. The surface was slick with algae, and twice the rope slipped before he could get it to hold. Eli joined him, their hands moving in practiced unison until the thick line was secure. Then they moved to the other side, repeating the process, anchoring the second rope so that they could haul evenly from both ends. Once the lines were set, they tested the strain. The Clam resisted, its shell unmoving at first, the pull of the tide pressing it deeper into the crevice between the rocks. Eli gritted his teeth, feeling the rope bite into his palms through the worn leather of his gloves. Leonard braced his legs against the side of the boat, the muscles in his arms standing out as he heaved. Slowly, the Clam shifted, just an inch, maybe two, but enough to break the seal of sand and silt that had held it in place for who knew how long. They pulled again, the ropes groaning under the strain, the water foaming where the great shell scraped against stone. Inch by inch, they worked it free, the muscles in their backs and shoulders burning, sweat stinging their eyes despite the cooling air. The glow between the clam's halves seemed brighter now, more insistent, as though it sensed its long entrapment was ending. When, at last, the clam slid clear of the rocks, it floated heavily in the water, its mass straining the ropes that tethered it to the roof. Eli felt the boat list under the weight, and for a moment he feared they would capsize. But she held, her old timbers creaking like an old woman's joints as she adjusted to the burden. Leonard secured the lines to the cleats, double knotting them for good measure, and they both stood for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the impossible thing they had just brought into their possession. The trip back was slow, the extra weight dragging at the Ruth's bow, making her plow deeper into the swells. The water slapped against her sides, sending up cold spray that soaked their clothes. More than once, Eli glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see another boat following them. But the channel behind lay empty, the rocks standing silent against the growing dark. The only sounds were the steady chug of the engine and the faint, rhythmic slap of water against the clam's shell as it rode the swells. By the time they reached the dock, the first stars had appeared, trembling in the black water. They worked quickly to unload their prize, using a pair of makeshift rollers and the combined strength of their aging bodies to get it onto the dock without breaking the shell. They covered it with an old tarpaulin, securing it with ropes, and without a word they hauled it up the narrow path toward Eli's shack. Inside, the air was close and dim, the single lamp casting long shadows across the floor. They set the clam down in the center of the room, the tarp still covering it. Eli poured them each a cup of strong coffee, and they sat at the table, the shape of the clam looming between them like a third presence. The room was filled with the sound of their breathing and the faint creak of the wood settling around them. Leonard was the first to speak. "We'll need to open it," he said, his voice quiet but certain. Eli nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. They both knew that whatever lay inside could change everything. For better or for worse, they had brought something into their lives that could not easily be forgotten or ignored. Eli set down his cup and reached for the tools they had used on stubborn traps and thick-shelled crabs, the heavy knife, the short-handled hammer. Leonard stood beside him, the lamplight catching the lines of his face, and together they stepped toward the covered shape on the floor. As they pulled back the tarp, the glow broke free, faint but steady, painting their hands in gold. Neither man spoke as they set to work on the hinge, the sound of metal against shell sharp in the quiet room. The clam resisted, as though reluctant to yield, but inch by inch they pried it apart, the glow growing stronger with each movement. And then, with a final creak, the shell gave way. What lay inside silenced them both. It was larger than either had dared to imagine, a perfect sphere of deep, warm copper light, its surface smooth as still water. The pearl seemed almost to breathe, the light within it shifting gently, like the rise and fall of a slow tide. For a long moment they could only stare, the enormity of what they had found settling over them like the weight of the sea. Eli felt something stir in him then, a mix of wonder and unease. He knew, with the same certainty he knew the tides, that their lives had just changed. And somewhere, far beyond the thin walls of his shack, the village slept on, unaware of the treasure that now sat in its midst. The glow of the pearl lingered in Eli's mind long after Leonard had gone home that night. Even with the clam's shell set aside in the yard and the treasure wrapped in thick cloth and tucked into the deepest corner of his shack, the memory of it lit the darkness behind his eyes whenever he closed them. It wasn't just the size or the strange, living quality of its light. It was the way it seemed to hum without sound, as if it carried some rhythm older than the sea itself. He lay in bed, listening to the wind slip between the cracks in the walls, the boards groaning softly with the night's cool, and thought about how nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Not the decades of fishing, not the storms weathered or the losses endured. There was no part of him that had ever truly expected to hold something so rare it might exist only once in a lifetime, or perhaps once in many lifetimes. Morning came slowly, a gray wash over the water, and with it a restlessness he couldn't shake. The village was already awake when he stepped outside, the sound of gulls cutting through the damp air, the scent of brine and wood smoke drifting from the cluster of houses down the shore. Eli had lived among these people for all his years, sharing in their work and their hardships, but as he walked the narrow path toward the dock, he felt something different in the way their eyes turned toward him. Conversations paused as he passed, just for a heartbeat too long, and though most still nodded in greeting, there was a flicker in their expressions he didn't like. Curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. He told himself it was nothing, just the natural watchfulness of a small community where news traveled faster than the tide. But the way a few of the younger men lingered near the docks without unloading their boats, the way an old woman who usually called out to him kept her mouth closed and her gaze on the ground, it set his nerves on edge. He kept his hand steady as he checked the roof, making sure the ropes were tied and the deck was clear, though he could feel the weight of their glances pressing on his back. By midday, the first whisper reached him in a form that couldn't be ignored. Leonard came by with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, his brow furrowed, and told him quietly that someone in the village had been asking questions. Not about the day's catch, but about whether Eli had been out by the headland recently, and whether he had brought something back. Leonard didn't say who had started it, but he didn't have to. Eli knew how these things began. A fisherman's wife noticed her husband's boat riding low in the water, or a boy saw something being carried up the beach in the dark. One detail passed to another, growing larger with each retelling, until the truth was buried under a net of rumor and speculation. That evening, when Eli went into town to trade for supplies, he felt it again. In the small store that smelled of salt pork and kerosene, the shopkeeper gave him a long look before bagging his flour and coffee, as if weighing whether to ask a question or let it lie. Outside, two men stood by the weathered post where fishermen sometimes mended their nets, speaking in low voices that stopped when Eli came near. One of them gave him a smile too quick to be real. Eli carried his sack back to the shack without slowing his pace, but inside, his thoughts were knotting tighter. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want anyone thinking they had a claim to what was his, nor did he want the kind of attention that could draw strangers to their shores. Yet, the more he tried to push the worry aside, the more he saw signs of it creeping in. A skiff he didn't recognize tied loosely at the far end of the dock. A pair of boys lingering near his yard until he stepped outside and they bolted, laughing too loudly. The sound of voices late at night, just beyond the edge of the lamplight, disappearing when he opened the door. The days blurred together in a haze of watchfulness. Eli went about his work on the water, but his eyes were drawn more to the horizon than to his nets, scanning for sails or the flash of oars. At night, he checked the pearl to be sure it was still there, still wrapped in its thick layers of cloth, its light hidden from view. Leonard came by often, sometimes under the pretense of sharing a drink, sometimes just to sit in silence, both men listening to the creak of the shack and the distant hiss of the tide. They didn't speak openly about the pearl anymore. There was an unspoken understanding that the less said, the better. Still, the change in the village deepened. The easy camaraderie that had always been there, shared stories over coffee, the quick offer of a helping hand, was fraying at the edges. Eli caught the way two neighbors argued in hushed tones by the fish sheds, glancing toward him as if his presence had cut their words short. A few days later, a fisherman named Curtis, a man with more debt than luck, stopped him on the dock and asked directly if he'd found something worth finding out there past the rocks. Eli only shook his head and walked on, but the look Curtis gave him was sharp, like the flick of a blade catching light. By the end of the week, it was no longer just the villagers. Word had spread farther, carried along the coast by someone who had seen something or heard enough to make the telling worth their while. Strangers began to appear, first one, then another, each arriving with a smile that didn't reach their eyes. They came under the guise of traders or men looking for seasonal work, but Eli recognized the way they watched, the way they lingered near the docks without purpose. A pair of them stopped by his shack one afternoon, asking if he'd seen any unusual shells or coral in the area. When he told them no, their eyes flicked over his shoulder toward the inside of the shack, as if measuring the space. That night, he sat at the table with Leonard, the lamplight throwing deep shadows across the worn boards. Leonard said what Eli had already been thinking, that the pearl had brought more than it was worth in trouble. They spoke in low voices, weighing what to do, the air between them thick with the knowledge that whatever choice they made would have to be soon. The village was small, and it could not hold a secret of this size for long. Every day that passed was another day the wrong kind of man might come looking. Eli felt the heaviness of it settle on him like a net pulled too full to lift. He thought of the pearl, its warm glow hidden in the dark, and the strange mix of pride and fear it stirred in him. He thought of the way the sea had given it up to him, as if in some unspoken bargain, and of the way human greed was already gnawing at the edges of that gift. It had been less than a fortnight since he had first seen the Clam's light in the fog, yet his world already felt narrower, more dangerous. When he lay down that night, the sound of the waves against the shore seemed sharper, more insistent, as though the ocean itself was urging him to act. Sleep came slow, and in its place came thoughts that circled like gulls above a trawler, thoughts of strangers' boots on his floor, of the pearl gone from its hiding place, of the shack standing empty. He knew then, with a clarity that cut through the haze of doubt, that the time for waiting was nearly over. The sea had given him something precious, and if he wanted to keep it safe, he would have to decide whether to cling to it or let it go before someone else made that choice for him. When dawn broke, pale and cold over the village, Eli stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the horizon. The wind was from the east, carrying the smell of rain. Somewhere beyond that gray line of water, the wider world waited, ready to claim what he had. And standing there, with the boards cool beneath his bare feet, he understood that the whispers in the village were no longer whispers at all. They were the gathering breath before a storm. The rain arrived before noon, carried in on a hard wind from the east that whipped the bay into a restless chop. Eli stood at the window of his shack, watching the water darken under the shifting clouds. He had not gone out to fish that morning. There had been too many faces he didn't know moving about the dock, too many eyes that seemed to linger on him longer than they should. The whispers had grown louder over the past 2 days, and with them had come a steady trickle of strangers who asked questions with too much interest in their tone and too little care for disguising it. Some were bold enough to knock at his door, offering smiles and casual talk before steering the conversation toward what he might have come across while fishing the outer waters. Others didn't bother speaking at all, preferring to stand too long at the edge of his yard or stroll slowly past his shack, glancing at the windows as though they might catch a glimpse of something through the glass. Leonard came by that afternoon, his slicker beaded with rain, and without a word set a bundle of rope on the table. The look in his eyes told Eli he had news he didn't want to carry. Over the smell of damp wool and coffee, Leonard told him about two men who had arrived the night before, docking a small, sleek boat just outside the main harbor. They had asked around in the tavern, dropping the names of people in nearby towns who might do business with rare finds from the sea. They'd been careful not to say the word pearl, but the shape of their questions had left no doubt in Leonard's mind. When they'd left, they'd taken the road toward the village's edge, toward Eli's part of the shore. Eli felt the slow coil of dread tighten in his chest. It was no longer just idle curiosity. This was the kind of interest that could turn dangerous if it wasn't met with something it wanted. He thought of the pearl hidden in its cloth wrapping, the warm light it cast even in darkness, and for the first time he imagined it in someone else's hands, carried away from here in a burlap sack or a lockbox, gone from him forever. The thought made his jaw tighten. That night, the first of the threats appeared. It came as a scrap of paper wedged under his door, the ink blurred slightly from the damp but still legible. Everything from the sea belongs to the sea. Don't be the one to break that rule. The handwriting was uneven, almost hurried, but the meaning was clear enough. He showed it to Leonard the next morning, and though his friend tried to make light of it, Eli could see the weight of the message settle on him as well. 2 days later, he found his nets slashed and tangled beyond repair, left in a heap at the end of the dock. The cuts were clean, made by a sharp blade, not the fray of age or accident. He replaced them, but the damage went deeper than the loss of equipment. The village had always been a place where a man's tools were as safe in the open as they were locked inside his home. This was something new, an intrusion into the unspoken trust that bound them together. The breaking point came on a night when the wind had dropped and the rain had stilled to a fine mist. Eli had been sitting in his chair, staring at the dark window, when the faint creak of the porch boards reached his ears. He rose without haste, moving to the door in silence, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. When he opened it, a shadow shifted at the edge of the lamplight. Tall, narrow, a man trying to decide between fight and flight. Eli stepped forward, letting the light fall across his own face, and said nothing. The man's eyes flicked to the shack behind him, then back to Eli, weighing whatever chance he thought he had. It took only one step forward from Eli, his hand firm on the gun's stock, to send the figure retreating into the mist. The crunch of boots on wet sand faded quickly, but Eli stood on the porch for a long while after, listening to be sure he was truly gone. Sleep came fitfully after that, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of waves swallowing his shack whole, the pearl tumbling into the black depths beyond reach. In the daylight, the tension pressed harder. Strangers had begun to speak openly on the dock, trading guesses about the size and worth of the treasure they believed he had. One man, broad and red-faced from drink, told him outright that he'd heard the thing was worth more than any boat in the harbor. Eli didn't answer, just kept walking, but he felt the words follow him down the length of the planks, clinging like the smell of tar and salt. Leonard's visits grew more frequent, and with them came the same conclusion voiced in different ways. The pearl had to be moved, and soon. Every extra day it stayed here was another chance for someone to make a move bolder than the last. The museum in the city, large enough to hold something like this, secure enough to protect it, became the center of their talk. The offer of money was tempting, but it was the promise of safety, of putting it beyond the reach of the greedy and the desperate, that began to weigh heavier in Eli's mind. The decision was not an easy one. He would walk the shore in the evenings, his boots sinking into the wet sand, listening to the hiss of the tide, thinking of all the years he'd given to these waters. The pearl felt like a gift from the sea, a quiet acknowledgment of those years. To give it up felt like handing back a piece of himself. Yet the threats, the vandalism, the eyes that watched his every move, they were turning that gift into a burden too heavy to carry. On the morning he found the second note, this one pinned to his door with the tip of a fishing knife. Eli knew the choice was no longer his alone to make. The words were simpler this time. Time's up. The knife was one he recognized, the handle carved in the style of a man from a neighboring town, and that recognition chilled him more than the threat itself. It meant the reach of this had spread farther than he'd hoped. It meant that people who had never set foot in this village now thought of him as a man holding something they could take. That night, Eli sat at the table with Leonard, the lamp between them casting a small circle of light. The pearl lay wrapped in its cloth in the center, untouched but almost palpable in its presence. They didn't talk about what it was worth or how it would be moved. They spoke about the weather, about the tide, about the best route to the city and how many days the trip might take if the currents favored them. By the time the lamp's oil ran low, they both knew the plan without saying it outright. The next tide would be their window. They would leave quietly, under the cover of the early hours, and by the time the sun rose high over the bay, the Ruth would be far from sight. When Leonard left, Eli stood for a moment in the doorway, listening to the quiet beyond the whisper of the wind. Somewhere out there in the dark, the eyes that had been watching would be watching still. But for the first time in days, the path ahead felt clear, even if it meant leaving behind the only home he had ever known. The pearl was more than a prize now. It was a responsibility, and one that would destroy him if he tried to guard it here any longer. The sea had given it to him, but the world was already trying to take it. And Eli Harper was no fool. He would see it safely to a place where no one could take it from him again, no matter how far he had to go. The tide was still rising when Eli stepped out into the cold, pre-dawn air, the dampness clinging to his skin like an unshaken memory. The village was silent at this hour, the narrow dirt paths glistening from a night mist that had yet to lift, and the only sound was the slow breathing of the sea beyond the dock. He carried the bundle himself, cradled against his chest under layers of rough canvas, the weight of it both physical and something heavier, finality. Every step away from his shack felt like he was closing a door he might never open again. He had not slept more than an hour, lying awake through the long darkness, listening for footsteps on the porch, for the rattle of a latch. When the time had come, he did not bother with breakfast, only wrapped the pearl carefully, checked the lines on the Ruth, and waited for Leonard's familiar shape to emerge from the shadows. Leonard arrived without a word, his boots muffled on the damp earth, his face unreadable under the low brim of his cap. Together they moved down to the dock, each glance over their shoulders sharper than the last. The air was so still that every sound seemed to carry farther than it should. The creak of the boat as they stepped aboard, the soft clunk of the oars against their hooks, the low cough of the engine catching. Eli's hands were steady, but inside, a current of unease ran deep. They had chosen the hour to avoid attention, but he knew the village's restless curiosity would notice their absence by mid-morning, and if someone guessed their direction, they might not have the sea to themselves for long. The Ruth slid away from the dock with barely a ripple, her bow cutting into the black water. Behind them, the faint line of the shore receded until it was only a smudge against the paling sky. Eli kept his eyes on the channel ahead, navigating between the rocks with the same care he had when he'd first found the Clam. The tide's pull was with them, and the early light began to bleed across the horizon, streaking the water in shades of steel and pale rose. There was no talk between them at first, only the rhythm of the engine and the slap of small waves against the hull. Each man was caught in his own thoughts, weighing the risks ahead against the risks they were leaving behind. By the time they reached open water, the sun was edging above the line of the sea, and the wind had picked up, cool and steady from the west. Eli felt a shift in himself then, as if the very act of moving away from the village had loosened the knot in his chest. They were committed now, the decision made and in motion. The Pearl lay secured in the stern beneath layers of cloth and rope, hidden from sight, but its presence was constant, a quiet pulse in the space between them. The journey to the city would take them 2 full days if the weather held. The first stretch ran along the coastline, keeping the low cliffs and wooded inlets in view before they would turn east across the wider bay. The farther they traveled, the fewer the landmarks familiar to Eli's eyes. Small fishing camps dotted the shore here and there, smoke from morning fires curling into the air, but they did not stop. Every time another boat appeared in the distance, Eli's gaze sharpened, measuring its course until it passed harmlessly beyond the swell. He had no desire for conversation, not now, not when so much depended on staying unnoticed. Midday brought a change in the sky, a bank of dark clouds building far to the south. The wind shifted with it, bringing a rougher chop to the water, and Eli adjusted their course to hug the coast a little longer, letting the land break some of the swell. Leonard worked the bilge pump without complaint, keeping the water from pooling under the boards, and when they finally paused to eat, it was a quick meal of bread and smoked fish eaten in the lee of a sheltered cove. The conversation was sparse, practical. The museum would need proof of the Pearl's authenticity. The transaction had to be handled quietly to avoid drawing attention from collectors who might try to intercept it. The logistics kept their minds from drifting toward what-ifs. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the clouds began to thin, leaving streaks of gold light spilling through. Eli kept his focus on the water ahead, but part of him was already imagining the moment the Pearl would be beyond reach of the hands that sought it. He pictured it resting under glass in a quiet hall, its glow captured not as possession, but as something to be looked upon and remembered. That image brought him a measure of peace, though it was tinged with the ache of parting. They anchored for the night in a narrow inlet shielded by high bluffs, the water calm beneath the shadow of the rock. The sound of the open sea beyond was a distant thrum, a reminder of the miles they had yet to cover. They took turns keeping watch, each man sleeping lightly, ears attuned to the slightest change in the rhythm of the water or the whisper of the wind. The night passed without disturbance, and when the first light touched the sky, they were already preparing to set out again. The second day began with an expanse of open water, the coastline fading to a thin line behind them as they steered eastward. The city was still far beyond the horizon, but with every hour the sense of nearing their goal grew. The wind was with them, the Ruth's engine steady, and even the gulls seemed to guide their way, sweeping low before wheeling off toward some unseen shoal. By midday, the haze in the distance began to resolve into faint shapes, masts, towers, the suggestion of buildings rising from the edge of the water. The sight tightened Eli's throat. He had not been to the city in more than a decade, and he had never come with anything of such value in his care. As they drew closer, the harbor's breakwaters came into view, the water inside calmer and busier. Larger vessels moved with a practiced precision, ferries crossing paths with fishing boats, their decks lined with the day's catch. The smell of the city reached them before the sounds did, a mix of tar, smoke, and salt, undercut by something sharper, metallic. Eli felt Leonard's glance but kept his eyes ahead, steering the Ruth towards the smaller of the docks where the museum's contact had arranged to meet them. The man was waiting, a tall figure in a dark coat, his posture straight, his gaze direct. There was no preamble, no drawn-out greeting. They moved quickly from the dock to a nearby warehouse, the Pearl carried between them, still wrapped and unseen. Inside, the bundle was set upon a sturdy table, and with hands that were steady but not without reverence, Eli unwrapped it layer by layer until the warm copper light spilled into the dimness. The man's intake of breath was sharp, his eyes widening as he circled it once, twice, before touching nothing at all. The appraisal was brief but thorough, and when the man spoke again, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. He confirmed its rarity, its extraordinary size, the unique hue that set it apart from anything in living memory. The museum would take it, he said, and not only that, they would honor its finder in the way such a discovery deserved. A sum was agreed upon, enough to end the constant worry of bills and repairs, enough to give Eli a comfort he had never expected in his remaining years. But more than the money, it was the promise that the pearl would be kept safe, guarded, and preserved, its light shown to the world rather than hidden in fear. When they left the warehouse, the day had turned clear and bright, the city's waterfront alive with movement and noise. Eli stood for a moment, watching the ships in the harbor, feeling the shift inside himself. The pearl was no longer his to guard, but in a way it still belonged to him. Its story, from the fog-bound channel to this place, was bound to his own life. And though part of him felt the hollow space of its absence, another part felt lighter, freed from the net of tension that had closed around him in the village. They made their way back to the Ruth in the late afternoon, the tide in their favor, the engine steady beneath them. Behind them, the city receded into the haze, and ahead lay the long stretch of water back to the quiet shore. Eli thought of the pearl under its new watch, safe from the hands that would have taken it in darkness. He thought of the sea and the gift it had given him, and of how, in giving it up, he had kept something of it for himself. When the coastline finally rose ahead of them, bathed in the gold of the setting sun, he felt ready to return, not as the man who had brought the pearl home, but as the man who had let it go. The return voyage felt different from the one that had taken them to the city. The wind was lighter, the sea calmer, and the Ruth rode the swells with an easy rhythm, as if the water itself understood the burden she had carried was gone. The absence of the pearl's weight in the stern was more than physical. Eli felt it in his chest, in the quiet way his thoughts moved now, no longer circling the same knot of worry. Yet there was an emptiness too, a hollow space where its glow had been, and he could not decide if the lightness or the loss weighed more. Leonard sat across from him, hat pulled low against the sun, neither man speaking much. Their work together was done, but there was no need for ceremony. The sea had heard everything that needed saying. By late afternoon, the familiar line of the village came into view, the low roofs and weathered docks crouched against the shoreline. The tide was on the turn, drawing the scent of the wet flats into the air. As they drew closer, Eli saw the same faces he had known for decades moving about the dock, but something in their manner had shifted. There were still glances in his direction, still the quiet between words when he passed, but it was different now, less sharp-edged. The rumors had lost their anchor. Whatever they had imagined he'd had, it was no longer here to chase. They tied up the Ruth, and Leonard gave him a brief nod before heading off toward his own home, the coil of rope over his shoulder catching the last of the sun. Eli lingered a moment on the dock, running his hand over the worn rail of the boat, feeling the roughness where years of salt had eaten into the grain. Then he turned up the path toward his shack, the boards creaking beneath his boots in the same familiar way, the gulls calling overhead as if nothing had changed. Inside, the air was still and faintly cool, the way it always was when the windows had been shut against the wind. The space felt larger now without the pearl hidden in its corner, as if a shadow had been lifted from the walls. He set his bag down on the table and poured himself a cup of coffee, the bitter smell filling the room, grounding him. Outside, the light had begun to soften, the edge of the day slipping toward evening. He took the cup and stepped onto the porch, the wood warm under his feet where the sun had touched it all afternoon. The horizon was painted in deep gold and streaks of rose, the water reflecting it in broken patterns that shifted with each small wave. Eli settled into the old rocking chair, the one that had been Ruth's, and let it move with the slow creak it had always made. The sound was as much a part of his evenings as the smell of salt in the air. He thought of the pearl then, not with the sharp pang of loss, but with a steady warmth. In some hall in the city, its light would be shining now, caught in the glass for strangers to wonder at. His name would be there beside it, carved into a small plaque, and though he would not see it often, he knew it was enough. The sea had given him that gift, and he had given it a place where it could not be taken. A letter sat folded in his pocket, its paper thick and smooth, the museum's crest pressed into the corner. It was a note of thanks, written in careful hand, with the promise that he was welcome to visit whenever he wished, to see the pearl in its new home. Eli had read it 3 times on the journey back, and now, in the quiet of his porch, he read it again. The words did not change, but they settled deeper each time, rooting themselves into the part of him that still carried the memory of the glow. The village went on around him as the light faded. He could hear the distant clink of tools being put away, the muffled laughter of children racing down the path to the shore, the low murmur of voices as neighbors called to one another. Life was as it had been before the Clam had wedged itself between the rocks, before the golden light had turned his days inside out. And yet, Eli knew it was not the same. He was not the same. He had been given a moment that most men would never see, and though it had passed, it had left its mark. As the sun dipped lower, the gold deepened into amber, and the water took on the stillness that came just before dark. Eli finished his coffee and let the cup rest on the railing beside him. The air was cooling, carrying with it the faint promise of the night ahead, and somewhere beyond the headland the tide was moving in its eternal cycle. He thought of how many more mornings and evenings he might have, and the thought brought no fear, only a quiet acceptance. He had lived long enough to know that the sea's gifts were never truly yours to keep. They passed through your hands like water, and what you held on to was the memory, the knowing that you had been part of its story. He sat until the last of the light slipped below the horizon, the sky fading to a soft, dusky blue, the first stars pricking through above the dark line of the sea. The chair rocked gently beneath him, the boards whispering in their familiar way, and Eli let the sound carry him into stillness. For the first time in many years, he felt no weight pressing at the edges of his thoughts. The pearl was safe, the village was quiet, and the sea, ever constant, was there before him, its surface breathing under the moon's first light. When he rose at last, it was with the slow ease of a man who knew he could take his time. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and let the darkness settle over the shack. Outside, the tide moved on, the waves folding into one another, carrying their secrets far from shore, and Eli Harper, alone but untroubled, carried his own secret still, the knowledge that for a brief, unrepeatable moment, the sea had chosen him. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Check out our other videos for more incredible tales, and share this one with your friends so they can enjoy it too.